shook my front door. The moment I opened it, my daughter collapsed into my arms, wearing the same wedding dress she had left in only hours before. It was torn, soaked with mud, and her face and arms were covered with dark bruises. Through trembling sobs, she whispered, "Dad, he hit me 45 times." I reached for my phone to call the police, but she grabbed my wrist and pleaded, "Please don't, not yet. If you call them now, you'll never learn what really happened on my wedding night." Before sunrise, I uncovered a secret far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city? Your country? I read every single one. Here on Revenge. Dad, every story carries a lesson worth staying for. Note: some elements have been dramatized for storytelling depth. Any similarity to specific names or locations is entirely coincidental. The last thing I remembered before the knocking was the way Lily had smiled at me across the reception hall. She was standing beside Derek near the champagne tower, her white gown catching the warm light of the chandeliers, laughing at something one of his cousins had said. It was the kind of laugh that came from her stomach, the same laugh she'd had since she was 4 years old, loud and completely unself-conscious. I had driven home at 12:20 in the morning, telling myself I was worrying over nothing, telling myself I had raised a strong woman who knew her own mind. I was 65 years old. I had spent 30 years catching people who lied for a living. I should have known better than to believe my own reassurances. The knocking started at 2 in the morning. It wasn't the sound of someone at a door. It was the sound of someone using the last strength they had left to reach one. 3 slow, uneven impacts against the wood, like a fist that had forgotten how to make a fist. I was out of bed before the third knock landed, my heart already slamming against my sternum, the way it used to, before I walked into a room where I knew something had gone badly wrong. I crossed the hallway in the dark and pulled open the front door. The porch light fell over my daughter like a spotlight over a crime scene. Lily stood on the welcome mat in her wedding gown, or what was left of it. The silk was torn from the left shoulder down to the hip, streaked with dirt, and something darker I didn't want to name yet. Her feet were bare, and the concrete had opened 3 long cuts across her right heel that were still bleeding onto the mat. Her hair had come completely loose from whatever elaborate arrangement had taken 2 hours that morning, hanging in tangled ropes around a face I almost didn't recognize, not because it was swollen, though it was, but because every expression I had ever seen on my daughter had been replaced by something hollow and locked down and very, very far away. "Lock the door," she whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Lock it and don't let them bring me back." My chest cracked open like dry wood. I reached for her arm and pulled her inside, and the moment her body crossed the threshold, she grabbed the front of my shirt with both hands and pressed her forehead against my collarbone and started shaking so hard I could hear her teeth knock together. I wrapped both arms around her and held on, and I looked over the top of her head at the empty street outside, the parked cars, the neighbors' dark windows, the ordinary California night that had apparently been going on, completely unaware of whatever had just happened to my child. I kicked the door shut, threw the deadbolt, then the chain. "Lily." I kept my voice low, and even the voice I used 30 years ago when I was talking someone down from a ledge of a different kind. "I need you to stay right here for 30 seconds. Can you do that?" She lifted her face. Her lower lip was split, and her left cheekbone was darkening into a bruise the size of my palm. But it was her eyes that stopped me. Not tears, not panic, but a flat, exhausted calculation, like she had already done all the math on tonight and arrived at the only answer that made sense. "There were 45, Dad," she said. "I counted every single one. My legs wanted to stop working. I didn't let them. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and called Frank Delgado before I called anyone else. Frank had spent 22 years as a homicide detective with the LAPD before his knees gave out and forced him into retirement, and in 30 years of working adjacent cases, I had never met anyone who understood evidence preservation the way Frank did. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he wasn't sleeping either. "Ray?" His voice was sandpaper and coffee. "What happened?" "My daughter just came home from her wedding reception," I said. "She's injured. I need you to tell me exactly what to do in the next 10 minutes before I call 911. There was a single beat of silence. Then Frank shifted into the precise, unrushed cadence he used when the situation required thinking faster than it required talking. "Don't let her change clothes," he said. "Don't let her shower or wash her hands. Get your phone and photograph everything: her dress, her feet, her face, her arms, every visible injury before anything is touched or cleaned. Do you have a clean paper bag? Not plastic." "Paper." "Kitchen?" "Yes." Put the dress in it after the paramedics clear her. Paper breathes, it won't degrade biological evidence the way plastic will. And Ray." He paused. "Write down the exact time you opened that door." 2:03, I said, looking at the clock above the stove. "Good. Now, call 911. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I spent the next 8 minutes doing exactly what Frank told me to do. I photographed Lily's dress from 4 angles while she stood in the entryway and let me her arms wrapped around her own ribs like she was trying to hold herself together from the outside. I photographed her feet, her wrists, where dark band-shaped bruising was already rising to the surface of her skin and the left side of her face. She didn't flinch away from the camera. She stood with her chin slightly raised and her jaw set, and that more than anything else told me how much it had cost her to get through tonight, because my daughter had always hated having her picture taken. "You're doing great," I told her, and my voice only broke a little bit at the end. "I got out," she said. Her eyes filled, but she blinked it back hard, refusing to let it spill. "I just kept thinking I'd just have to get out and get to you. That's the only thing I thought about." My throat closed completely. I turned away to get the paper bag from under the kitchen sink because I needed 5 seconds to press the heel of my hand against my mouth and breathe. Then I called 911. While we waited for the ambulance, I sat on the couch beside Lily, with her cold hand between both of mine, and I looked at the door I had just bolted shut, and I thought about the 30 years I had spent finding people who thought they had gotten away with something. I thought about how they always believed the evidence was gone. They were almost always wrong. Whoever did this, I thought, is already building their story. I need to build mine faster. The paramedics moved through my living room, like they owned it, and I let them. There were 2 of them, a young woman with red hair pulled back tight, and an older man whose hands never once stopped moving as he worked. They had Lily on the gurney in under 4 minutes, an oxygen sensor clipped to her finger, a blood pressure cuff inflating on her arm, a flashlight checking her pupils. I stood in the corner of my own entryway, holding the paper bag with her wedding dress inside, and watched them work, and I felt something cold and very precise settle into the center of my chest. Not grief, not panic. Focus. Frank Delgado arrived at the same moment the ambulance was pulling away from the curb. He jogged up the driveway in a gray sweatshirt and old running shoes, his white hair flattened on one side from the pillow, and he took one look at my face and said, "How about 45?" I said. Frank closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and held out his hand for the paper bag. He turned it over carefully in both hands, checking the seal, checking the fold at the top, then handed it back. "Good," he said. "You did it right. I'll follow you to the hospital." Huntington Hospital received us the way emergency rooms receive everyone at 2:30 in the morning, with fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner and a triage nurse who had clearly seen too much to be shocked by anything. They took Lily back immediately. Frank and I sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes before a doctor came out to speak with me. Her name was Dr. Renee Castillo, and she had the careful, measured delivery of someone who had learned to give hard information without flinching. She sat across from me with a clipboard on her knee and told me that Lily had sustained 45 documented injuries, contusions, and soft tissue damage concentrated across her upper back, shoulders, arms, hips, and thighs. Positions, Dr. Castillo said, that were consistent with deliberate targeting of areas that would be concealed by clothing. Her right wrist shows ligature-style bruising. Dr. Castillo continued, consistent with forceful restraint. There are also compression marks on both forearms, suggesting she was held down against a flat surface for an extended period. I pressed my back teeth together until my jaw ached. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked. "She's going to need time," Dr. Castillo said carefully. "But yes, she's stable." I nodded. I trusted myself to nod. I did not trust myself to speak for another few seconds. When they let me into Lily's room, Frank waited outside. She was propped up slightly against the pillows, an ice pack wrapped in a towel pressed against her left cheekbone, an IV line taped to the inside of her elbow. The hospital gown made her look younger than 28. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did something complicated: relief and exhaustion, and a grief so raw it made my own eyes burn. "Hey, Dad," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. "Hey, sweetheart." I pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down and took her hand in both of mine, and I felt her fingers curl around mine and squeeze hard enough to hurt, and I was grateful for it. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived 20 minutes later. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with sharp, attentive eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she had learned early in her career that how you walked into a room told people everything about whether they could trust you. She introduced herself quietly, showed her badge, and asked if Lily was willing to give a statement. Lily looked at me. I gave her hand one squeeze and let go. "Yes," Lily said. "I'm willing." She told it the way she had probably rehearsed it a dozen times on the taxi ride over, steady and sequential, one detail after another, no editorializing. The room at the Ashford Grand. Carolyn waiting inside with the lawyer and the guard, the documents on the table, Derek locking the door, the moment she understood that this was not a misunderstanding. "He held my wrists," Lily said, and her voice dropped but didn't break. "He held them against the headboard and he told me to stop fighting. He said." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Her free hand gripped the edge of the hospital blanket so hard her knuckles went pale. "He said the sooner I signed, the sooner it would be over," Detective Mitchell wrote without looking up from her notepad. "And you refused to sign." "Every single time," Lily said, and for just a moment, something fierce and burning moved across her face like a weather front. "Every single time." Mitchell clicked her pen once and looked up. "Ms. Cole, I need to share some information with you, and I want you to hear it before I explain what it means." She paused just long enough to make sure she had both our attention. "The Ashford family contacted law enforcement at approximately 1:15 this morning, roughly 40 minutes before your father called 911. They reported that you had consumed an excessive amount of alcohol at the reception, become combative, taken a set of wedding jewelry valued at $180,000, and fled the hotel without cause." The blood drained out of Lily's face so fast I reached for her arm. "They told the police I stole from them," she said. Her voice had gone very flat and very quiet, the way a voice gets when the brain is working too fast for the mouth to keep up. "Before I even got here, She stopped. Her chin started to tremble, and she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and took 3 hard breaths through her nose. "They knew I was going to get away. They planned for it. They already had a story." "Oh, that's what it looks like," Mitchell said. There was something careful and honest in her voice that I appreciated. She wasn't sugarcoating it, but she wasn't delivering it like a blow either. 20 minutes later, Derek Ashford appeared in the hallway outside Lily's room. He was still in his wedding tuxedo. His bow tie was loosened, and his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was crying with the practiced sincerity of a man who had rehearsed it. A lawyer in a dark suit stood at his shoulder. Derek spread both hands in a gesture of helpless anguish and said loudly enough for the nurses at the station to hear, "I just want to know that my wife is safe. Please, I just need to see her." I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. Derek's eyes found mine, and something shifted behind the grief just for a fraction of a second. A quick recalculation like a man adjusting his footing. Then the tears came back and he took a step toward me with his hand outstretched. "Raymond," he said, "please, whatever she told you, she came home to me with 45 injuries," I said. I kept my voice level and my hands loose at my sides. "Before you say one more word, I need you to understand that I counted every single one of them, and I have been doing this kind of work for 30 years. I looked at him for a long moment. "Go home, Derek." His hand dropped. The lawyer put a firm hand on his elbow and murmured something close to his ear, and Derek let himself be steered back toward the elevator, his shoulders shaking with sobs that cut off the moment the elevator doors closed between us. I went back into Lily's room. She was watching the door, her eyes bright and hard and waiting. "Was that him?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "Nothing that mattered." I sat back down and reached into my jacket pocket and took out my wallet. Opened the small inner fold I hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside, behind an old dry cleaning receipt, was a business card, plain white. A single phone number in black ink, no name. I had been carrying it so long, the edges had gone soft. Lily watched me stare at it. "Dad," she said quietly. "What is that?" "Something I should have dealt with a long time ago," I said. The hospital hallway at 3:47 in the morning had the particular silence of a place that never fully sleeps. The distant beep of monitors, the soft compression of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the hum of a vending machine at the far end of the corridor, offering bad coffee at $2 a cup. I sat in a plastic chair outside Lily's room with the business card balanced on my knee and stared at it until the numbers started to blur. 22 years. That was how long I had been carrying this card. Long enough that the ink had faded slightly at the center where my thumb had pressed against it over and over in moments exactly like this one. Moments when I almost called and then talked myself back from the edge. I had 1,000 reasons not to call. Every single one of them felt very small at 3:47 in the morning with my daughter sleeping behind a hospital door. I pressed call. It rang twice. "Raymond." The voice that came through the line was low and clear and completely awake, as if she had been sitting beside her own phone, waiting for it to ring. There was no surprise in it, only a weight like a held breath finally released. "You wouldn't call me unless it was about her." My throat tightened so fast it hurt. "It is," I said. "She needs her mother." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. "I'll be there," Margaret Ellison said. "Don't let anyone into that room until I arrive." She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the dead phone against my ear for a moment, longer than I needed to, then lowered it to my lap. My hand was trembling just slightly, just enough that I noticed it, and I pressed it flat against my thigh until it stopped. 30 years of keeping steady in rooms where things had gone wrong, and it was a 40-second phone call that finally got to me. 42 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the emergency entrance. I was standing at the glass doors when it arrived. Margaret Ellison stepped out first, and the thing that always struck me when I saw her after long stretches of absence, was how completely she occupied whatever space she walked into. She was 62 years old, dressed in dark slacks and a charcoal blazer over a simple shirt, her silver-streaked hair pulled back without fuss. No jewelry, except a watch. Nothing about her appearance announced wealth or authority. Everything about the way she moved did. Behind her came Sandra Okafor, Margaret's chief legal counsel, a tall woman in her mid-40s with a leather portfolio under one arm and the focused expression of someone who had already been working for an hour before she left the house. Sandra was scanning the building as she walked, her eyes moving in the quick, professional pattern of someone cataloging exits and sight lines. Margaret crossed the distance between the car and the entrance without looking left or right, and when she reached me, she stopped and met my eyes, and neither of us said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she said, "How bad is it, Raymond?" 45 injuries, I said. Documented, concentrated on her back arms and hips, places her dress would cover. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not tears. Margaret Ellison did not cry in parking lots, but a tightening around the eyes and jaw that I recognized as the same expression she had worn 22 years ago, when she had signed the papers that sent Lily to live with me and told herself it was the right thing to do. "Does she know who I am?" Margaret asked. "No. You never told her." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of a fact we both already knew. "She stopped asking when she was 12, I said. "I kept waiting for the right moment. I looked at the automatic doors. There was never a right moment." "No," Margaret said, and her voice dropped half a register. "There wasn't. I know that better than anyone." Sandra stepped forward before the conversation could go anywhere. Neither of us was ready to go. "I need to know if the hotel has been contacted by law enforcement yet," she said to me directly, her voice crisp and businesslike. "And whether any preservation requests have gone out for their surveillance systems." "Not yet," I said. Detective Mitchell took Lily's statement. "I don't know where the investigation stands as of right now." Sandra was already opening her portfolio. "Then we move first," she said. "What's the name of the hotel?" "The Ashford Grand, downtown Los Angeles." She wrote it down without looking up. "Who manages their building systems?" "Do you know?" "No. But Frank Delgado is inside. He's a retired LAPD homicide detective. He can tell you who to contact." Sandra nodded, once clicked her pen, and walked through the automatic doors with the forward momentum of someone who had never in her life waited to be invited into a room. Margaret watched her go. Then she turned back to me and said, "Take me to Lily." I brought her in through the side corridor and introduced her to the night nurse as an old family friend who was also providing legal support, which was accurate in every factual sense and wrong in every other sense imaginable. The nurse checked Margaret's ID and waved us through. Lily was awake. She was sitting up slightly against her pillows, the ice pack still pressed to her cheek, staring at the ceiling, with the expression of someone whose mind was moving faster than she wanted it to. She looked over when we came in, and her eyes moved from me to Margaret and back again with the quick, perceptive assessment she had inherited from Well. "This is Margaret Ellison," I said. "She's an old friend. She's also going to make sure you have the legal support you need." Lily studied Margaret for a moment, with eyes that were red-rimmed but sharp. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was hoarse and scraped raw. "Thank you for coming." Margaret stepped to the side of the bed. She stood close enough to reach out and touch Lily's hand, but did not reach out. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were doing something complicated that she was working very hard to control. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful and even. "Can you tell me what happened?" she said. "In your own words, at whatever pace you need." Lily looked at her for one more moment, taking in something about Margaret's face that she couldn't quite name, yet some quality of attention that went beyond professional concern. And then she started talking. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter tell her story to her mother for the first time, and I pressed the back of my knuckles against my mouth and breathed through my nose and told myself I was going to hold it together. I almost managed it. At 5:12 in the morning, Sandra appeared at my elbow with her phone in her hand, showing me a sent confirmation. Litigation hold letter delivered to the Ashford Grand's legal department and registered agent, she said quietly. It requires them to preserve all surveillance footage, keycard access logs, server records, staff schedules, and room service entries from the past 72 hours. Under California law, any destruction of that material after receipt of this notice constitutes spoliation of evidence, which carries its own legal consequences separate from the underlying charges. What does that mean in plain language? I asked. It means, Sandra said, that if they try to delete anything now, they've just handed us another crime to prosecute them with. I looked through the small window in the door at Lily and Margaret, my daughter talking, her hands moving, and Margaret leaning slightly forward in her chair, with an expression on her face that looked from this angle very much like a woman trying not to shatter. By the time the sun rose over Pasadena, the Ashford family's window to erase the evidence was already closed. They just didn't know it yet. I left the hospital at 7:15 in the morning. Lily had finally fallen into a proper sleep around 6, the kind that comes after the body has simply run out of ways to stay awake. Margaret was sitting in the chair beside her bed, with a cup of cold coffee balanced on her knee, and her eyes fixed on Lily's face with an expression I had no business witnessing. So I looked away and told Margaret I would be back by noon. She nodded without looking up. Sandra was already in the corridor on her phone, 3 steps ahead of whatever was coming next. Frank was waiting for me in the hospital parking lot, leaning against the hood of his truck with his arms crossed and a paper cup of actual decent coffee from the diner across the street extended in my direction. I took it with both hands. "Talk to me," he said. "The family reported her for theft before she even got here," I said. "They had a video of her walking unsteady in the lobby. They called it alcohol impairment." Frank's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened in the way they did when a detail landed wrong. "Timestamp on the video." Mitchell didn't say. "That's the first thing we need." He pushed off the hood of the truck. "And we need to find whoever brought her to you. You said she came by taxi." She told me, no phone, no wallet, no money. Driver still took her. Frank nodded slowly, already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Cab companies GPS log every fare. If we can pull traffic camera footage from the area around the Ashford Grand between 1 and 2 in the morning, we find the cab. We find the cab. We find the driver. We find the driver. We find someone who saw her before any of this became a story." "I finished." Frank pointed at me. "Now you're thinking like a cop again." We drove separately to the block around the Ashford Grand in downtown Los Angeles. The hotel occupied the corner of a wide intersection, all glass and brushed steel, and a canopy that probably cost more than my first house. At 8 in the morning, the city was already moving delivery trucks, double parked on the side street. A coffee cart doing brisk business on the corner, pigeons conducting their own investigations on the sidewalk. I sat in my car and pulled up the intersection on my phone, while Frank made 2 calls to people whose names he didn't share with me. That was fine. Frank had spent 22 years building a network of people who owed him favors or trusted his judgment, and I had long since learned not to ask questions about the machinery that kept that network running. 14 minutes later, he knocked on my passenger window and got in. "Traffic Management Division," he said. "I've got a contact there who pulled the relevant camera angles for the time